When Virginia called me and asked me if I would be a discussant on this panel, I said, well, gee, I really don't know very much about bilingualism. I'm the editor of a journal called Current Directions in Psychological Science. I've invited a couple of papers, and I've been on a dissertation, and that's about the level I know this. I find it really a fascinating thing. And she said, well, I'm really interested in the similarity between the work on working memory training, which I've done a lot on and have been the source of a good bit of that controversy in that area. And so she said, well, you can rely on that. And I said, well, that's fine. And I said, make sure that the people get me their talks before the meeting. And so I have to tell you two stories. One is something that happened to me when I was a very young man, just new in the field, and I went to a conference, and this very famous psychologist stood up to be a discussant, and his name was David Seaman, and he said, my mother told me when I was a young lad, David, if you're ever a discussant at an important scientific conference, and the people don't send you their talks ahead of time, you just stand up and say, that reminds me of my work. So this reminds me of my work. I got them Saturday, having nothing else to do, of course, on Saturday. Secondly, when a former student of mine found out that I was going to do this, he said, gee, there's a lot of controversy in that bilingualism area. Randy, are you sure you want to get involved in that? And I reminded him, my wife is as brassy a woman as you've ever met in your life, and she rides a very large motorcycle, and she's got the following T-shirt. And it shows a nun on what's called a cafe racer. You'd have to be old to understand what that is. And the caption says, wherever there is sin, there I must go. And I said, so that's where I must go. So I'm going to talk to you today about some issues in this area that I think we can learn some things from the controversy in working memory training, but also some other areas as well. And unfortunately, I can't see this well enough without my glasses, so I'm going to have to read this all the same as you. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things, one of which is some problems in replicating findings in psychology. We happen to be in an era right now where our field is really doing a lot of self-questioning and outside questioning about the validity and replicability of our work. I just reviewed a paper for Science that's going to be published, I think, and this was an amazing study. It had 68 authors on this paper, and it was an attempt to replicate 90 different studies from 3 journals, and those 3 journals were important journals in the field: Psychological Science, Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition, and Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And so they had all of these teams of scientists all over the world work with the authors of the original papers to try to replicate these findings. And what they found, I think I put it out up there, that only about 40% of the findings that were classified as cognitive were replicable, and just over 30% of the findings in social psychology were replicable. Think about that. When you think of all of your mother's tax money that's gone into all of that work, and 40% at best is replicable. And these are great journals, right? I mean, you'd love to have a paper in any of these journals. One other thing, not just to beat up on the social psychologist here, but if you look at the mean effect size for the replications in Journal of Personality and Social, it did not differ from 0. That's damning, right? So we're at a time when I think, generally speaking, we are doing an awful lot of hopefully reflective thought about our field. Now, it says up there at some point, I remain optimistic. How could you be optimistic after that? Because I think, we are a good science, and I think we are at a point where we're going to be looking at these things, and we're getting it here. I happen to really like the bilingualism stuff that I've read. It's an interesting idea, and I'll tell you in a moment that it, it's quite believable to me that that these so-called executive functions are trainable, that we get better at them, that, I think of them as mental behaviors. You don't have to scratch me very far to get to the behaviorist in me. And I think of them as mental behaviors, and like other behaviors, shooting a layup or hitting a curveball, you can get better at it with practice. And I think that is the case with these executive functions as well. Nevertheless, I think they do rely on some fairly fundamental aspects of cognition, which may not be so trainable, but I think we can get better at them. I think the problems in the area, and I will overgeneralize probably to the bilingualism area, again, because I just don't know this area well enough to be standing up here talking to you, in all honesty. I think you've heard many of them talked about here. Virginia mentioned some things this morning. Jennifer Manley, I thought her talk was really excellent. I got a chance to listen to it on the plane on the way up here, fortunately. Just laid out some really important issues that we need to think about. Small n, it is just such a problem with psychology that we use these small samples. Any science, depending upon samples, suffers from a number of issues, one of which is something called regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is not just something you find in psychology. You find it in incidents of hurricanes in Miami, for goodness sakes. I mean, it's a fact of science that when you use samples, that the mean of your sample is going to vary greatly. And you see that hugely in the areas that I'm going to talk about here. The low reliability of the measures, and that something that I've at lunch and afterwards talking with some folks about, and it came up a bit in discussion this morning, very subtle changes in some of these so-called executive function tasks can lead to huge differences in the findings. So I've done some work on the Stroop. I do big-scale structural equation modeling studies, much like Naomi talked about this morning. The last study we did had 650 people. Each person had 40 different tasks. We had genetics analysis on all of them. I mean, these are big-scale studies. And I can tell you that some of these tasks, very slight tweaking, will lead to very different patterns. And one of those is the Stroop, for example. And so if you do the Stroop the way that most clinicians do it, where all of the trials are either congruent in one section and all of the trials are incongruent in another, we really don't find much of anything that's interesting as it relates to fluid intelligence or working memory capacity or any of the higher level cognitive abilities that we're interested in, multitasking and so forth. If, on the other hand, you have the trials vary in congruency, so that 25, 50, 75% of the time, the person's naming red in red ink, but you look at when they have to say the word red in green ink, that's where you find a really interesting pattern. That's where cognitive control becomes a real issue. So just that very subtle point. The flanker task, we've manipulated the response deadline in the flanker task, and if you give people just about as much time as they want so that they're still quite accurate on that task, we find very little to no differences there. But if we impose a response deadline, you don't have to push them to respond very quickly before you see quite substantial effects of fluid intelligence and working memory capacity. Most people would look at that and say, well, those are just tweaking around the edges of these tasks. Yes, they are, and I think that's the point. I did an interview on Friday with the National Public Radio station in San Francisco, and I was trying to describe some of this, and she said, well, Dr. Engle, that's just the details of the work, really. I said, yeah, that's the problem, right, is these are subtle but really important details, and I think that's going to be really important in whether you find these effects of the effects of bilingualism or not. You just can't assume that the Stroop is the Stroop is the Stroop. They're just not. I think another area up there is what I call comorbid variables among our subjects. That is just so important. Jennifer said, I'm guessing jokingly, that we might randomly assign people to either monolingual or bilingual conditions. As I tell my undergraduate students, my introductory students, you wouldn't want to live in a society that would let you do that experiment, right? But that's sort of what you need to do. there are huge differences in people, many of these differences we don't even know about. So the assumption in these working memory training studies, or I'm going to mention video games in a minute, and I think the bilingual monolingual studies as well, is that these subjects are identical in every other way except this. And that's just a really, really difficult assumption to make. Let me give you just one example, this working memory capacity and L2 learning. I've done a good bit of work through something called the Center for Applied Study of Linguistics at the University of Maryland. That's a shill program for the CIA, NSA, and the Defense Language Institute. And some of the people in this room have done work there. A big part of what they hired me to do several years ago was to give input into a new test to decide who should be chosen to learn various languages at the Defense Language Institute. Why would that be important? Because it costs about $250,000 a year to train somebody Korean or Hungarian, right? And if you do that for a year and they haven't passed the test, you've wasted that money. And so they went through this whole big rigmarole to develop a new test, and they have. It's something called DLAB 2, which is just about to be declassified, I think. I just gave you some privileged information here. Edward Snowden will be on my back in a minute, I'm sure. And it turns out that that measures of working memory capacity, and I'm going to say working memory capacity because it's highly related to fluid intelligence, and fluency then becomes really important. There's a story there, which I hope I have time to tell you. That was added a substantial amount of variance to the predictions for language. And this was done with real people, picking people, having them go through these classes out at Monterey, California. And it turns out that test has saved the American taxpayer $90 million a year, right? But it's a working memory capacity, fluid intelligence measure. So there clearly are big differences in who learns these languages quickly and who doesn't. Who's to say that the people who know the multiple languages now aren't in that group or weren't in that group at some point in a previous life? So what I'd like to, let me see, what else I want, what else I want to tell you about is I just want to talk a little bit about some of the problems in this working memory training literature, talk just very briefly about video games and about bilingualism. And what those three things have in common is that all of them putatively improve cognitive performance very broadly. It's been argued that based largely on this graph, which is something out of a paper of mine, Mike Kane is the senior author, at my lab in 2004. And what's really important about this is that correlation right there. The correlation, is there a way that I can get that bigger? It's showing the previous, I'm not. It'd be better if this were a little bit bigger. You're going to have to tell me when I'm going to be out of time.
You are out of time almost.
No, that's not.
Okay, so. Display settings. Now.
Up at the top. At the top.
Okay, let's see if we can do that.
Swap?
Swap, 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 swap. Swap. All right, we can.
That's okay. I've used shadow puppets in talks before, so.
Yeah, let's not waste our time.
Okay, that's fine. So we published this structural equation model here looking at the relationship between measures of working memory capacity at the structural level on the left and fluid intelligence on the right. The correlation between those two at the construct level is 0.64. That's been replicated in labs really all over the world, and it's between 0.6 and 0.8, that relationship between these two constructs at the construct level. Some folks looked at that and said, aha, working memory capacity causes fluid intelligence. And, you know, there's something else that I have my undergraduates do. My introductory students we say, like in responsive reading, correlation does not mean causation, right? You've all heard it your whole life. Correlation does not mean causation. Together, correlation does not mean causation. Well, what that means up here is that we could draw those arrows going in a variety of different directions, right? This is based on a theoretical assumption, And structural equation modeling is based on, it's a theory confirmation. Doesn't do a very good job disconfirming theory. So it could be that the correlation goes the other way, or it could be something entirely different. Now, the reason that that's important is that the people in the working memory training literature jumped on this, said, aha, if we increase working memory capacity, we should be able to increase fluid intelligence. Right? You see the logic. Well, it turns out that there are two other variables that have just about the same pattern of correlations as working memory capacity and fluid intelligence, and they're height and weight in human beings. Height and weight are correlated at about the 0.7 level. Now, when I was 21 years old, I was 6 feet 2 inches tall, and I weighed 190 pounds. Well, by that logic, I should be 8 feet tall now, right? No, they're highly correlated, but this doesn't work. And that's really the way it is with this. We've really started recently in my lab trying to disentangle this idea, these two constructs, and I think we've got a handle on that. It has different mechanisms. They're highly correlated. I think they're highly correlated because of this common attentional capability, the ability to focus. If it's inhibition that Lynn Hasher and Rose Zox have talked about for years, then that's a part of it. But I think it is a general attention capability, the kind of things that Mike Posner talked about as executive attention and so forth, very, very broadly. But people started trying to increase working memory capacity and increase fluid intelligence. And so that leads to this. This is a figure from there are a bunch of figures here I'm going to skip through. This is taken from a paper by a former student of mine, Tom Reddick, in Intelligence recently. And what Tom did was to go through and point out a bunch of studies in the working memory training literature and some potential concerns that you have. This is ideally what you ought to find in any training literature. And this is relevant to the bilingualism stuff. It's just that you just don't have the precondition, right? It's there, you just don't see it. But it's assumed that that your subjects are chosen, they're identical at pre-training, they get some kind of training, and then they're different, right? And that leads to intelligence or whatever it is you're measuring out here. The problem is that if you look at this literature over and over and over again, you find things like this, right? Now, I'm going to dissect this one a bit. This is just one of, I could pick 10 other studies here, or a dozen other studies. And what we can look at are two things. First of all, we got this idea of regression to the mean. We got a sample of control subjects and a sample of trained subjects. We assume that they're the same, but clearly they're quite different. Secondly, what people will often do is to ignore that and then look at the rise in the training group from pre to post. And that's what this author did, was to look at the increase in the green line without regard to the drop in the red line. Now, we can look out there and say, well, if you've got a large enough N, you might find that the green line is now higher than the red line. The problem is that there is a simple, very uninteresting explanation which accounts for this very well, and that is what you've got is regression to the mean in all conditions. Now, I don't know that that's the case, but, we're talking about millions of dollars that are going into this working memory training stuff. And I can tell you that, I know, because I've gotten a big chunk of it. I know that IARPA, the intelligence version of DARPA, has spent $50 million on this issue, on 3 grants, right? That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that would fund the labs of everybody in this room for a long time to come. And yet, you see this over and over and over again. Different study, different study, different study, different study, the same thing, right? So the way that you account for control group and experimental group is really, really important, and all of that has to be taken into account. There may be something there, but we need to make sure it's there before we go and sell it to Lumosity or CogMed or whomever. So the other issue here is even if there were effects, we don't know why. I'm not going to tell you about any of the big training studies that I've done. We're just finished a big one that we're writing up right now. What we do find is that we often get an improvement in spatial skills for these things. That's very different than saying that we're making people more generally intelligent. And I think if these papers had done that early, it would have been easier to, in fact, sell that, we can do some things to improve the equivalent of executive functions. I think meta-analyses are a useful exercise here, but, meta-analyses, to be honest with you, there's an old saying, it's garbage in, garbage out, for those of us that grew up in the programming when we actually had to write programs as children. And you see that a lot in the meta-analytic literature as well. You can't read this, I can't read this, but what this shows is a forest plot, and it's called a forest plot, by the way, if you didn't know that, because it's supposed to separate the forest from the trees. What's really critical here is that point right there. And if you've got what's called an active control group, that does not differ from zero. I think that's important, right? If you've got an inactive control group, it's slightly different from zero, but the effects are small under the best of circumstances. And when you've got small effects and you've got small n's, then you're going to have noise. And there may be something there, but we need to know that we're dealing with relatively small effects, and how much are we willing to throw at society? Do we want to take the cost of a new Brooklyn Bridge to train some school district children to get that much improvement? I'm guessing probably not. All right, video games is another issue where there's been just a great deal of discussion about people who watch video games learn all kind of improvements or develop all kind of improvements in executive function and so forth. It turns out that almost all those studies are extreme group designs. And extreme group designs, and I want to tell you, I probably got 50 publications on my Vita that are extreme group designs. And I apologize to you for them, okay? Because it turns out that it led me to be wrong in some very important ways. And I hope I have time to show you one of those, and because it has to do with fluency. In the video game literature, if you look at the full range, this is a paper that just came out. Nash Unsworth is the lead author on this in Psych Science, lead paper in Psych Science, I think last issue or the one before. If you look at the high-low video game use, what you find is a reasonably reliable advantage for high video game users. They've got higher cognitive abilities. A lot of these so-called executive functions they're better on. But when you look at the full range, those correlations are zero, just right at zero. Now, what that says to me is that when you're looking at these high event situations, high video game use and low to zero video game use, in 2015, you're probably talking about two very different groups of people. We had some people in that study who said they played video games well over 100 hours a week. Right? Now, these are university students, most of them, at Georgia Tech, some of them, and you have to worry about what's that kid going through, They're different people. So I just worry that that's not a representative of a manipulation that is generalizable to much of anything. Again, what's the mechanism involved? I think one of the strengths that we in psychology have had for a long time is to think about the mechanisms that contribute to these differences, whether we're talking about groups of people or we're talking about manipulations. What are the specific mechanisms involved? Just to say we do this and people get better, that just doesn't help us very much, I think, as a discipline. So let me just say that I've really been quite open to this whole idea that that bilingual experience led to advantages in so-called executive functions, partly because I'm hugely monolingual myself, and I do speak two languages, but one of them is West Virginian. And there's an old joke that I hear. I'm an adjunct at University of Edinburgh, and I hear very frequently, there's an old joke. What do you call somebody who speaks 3 languages, trilingual, 2 languages, bilingual, 1 language, American? right? And so it really is the case that I think many of us, I would love to speak multiple languages, but I'm not willing to do the work necessary to make that happen. And so I do think of these executive functions as trainable behaviors, if you will, and that bilingual experience may well be something that can do that. But we have to show it, and we have to show it well, and we have to show it as unequivocally as we possibly can, given the very noisy microscope that we have. I think so like I said, it makes sense to me in my way of thinking about cognition and ability and all of that. I do believe that we're limited. I think we have a pretty good understanding of the brain mechanisms, the genetic alleles that are important in the dopaminergic system. I think the frontal parietal system. I think we're really getting some important handles on that. But given that, I think we all can be better at doing a lot of these things we call executive functions. I think we all can be better attenders. I spent one whole summer doing nothing but reading mindfulness books by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk. And I found him to be, this is a person who really understands how to control his ability to attend, to block distraction. So I think we can learn to do those things better. And that's what sort of gave me some idea that the bilingualism stuff had some promise. I also like the idea that there's a yin and yang aspect to this, that bilingualism actually hurts you in vocabulary and in fluency as well. This is a structural equation model that I showed at Psychonomics last year. And the reason that this is important is if you look down here at the bottom, I published a paper in 1996 arguing that fluency, that working memory capacity was hugely related to fluency. It was based on high-low studies. We took upper quartile, lower quartile working memory capacity individuals and just had them set them down in front of a microphone, give them 10 minutes to tell me all the animals you can think of, all the male names you can think of, all the female names, that kind of fluency task. And it was a huge effect. It was there after 1 minute. It wasn't related to vocabulary as much as it was related to some other things. Well, when we look at that at the full-scale level, it turns out, as this model shows very, very clearly, that verbal fluency is not related to working memory capacity at all. It's hugely related to fluid intelligence. And it's this data, as much as anything else, that's led me to the idea that working memory capacity at the construct level is really about maintaining information and doing what you have to maintain that. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, is the ability to disengage from information. You've tested a hypothesis, it's proven wrong, and if you now test another hypothesis and that previous one comes to mind, you've got to block that and get on. And I think, so we're looking at these mechanisms that separate fluid intelligence and working memory capacity. I find it striking that fluency is one of those things that is hurt by bilingualism, suggesting that, that this competition between the two languages or multiple languages is really an issue. Because fluency is not just about how many words you know, it's your ability to retrieve something that you haven't already retrieved. And whether you tell people to do that or not, they will work hard not to say the same thing over and over again. So I argued that working memory capacity was important in working memory, or that the fluency was important in working memory capacity, and I was wrong. And I think that we all need to be totally prepared to stand up and say, I was wrong, I blew it. Thank you. Tore up your microphone, sorry.